Carpet Burns and a Bite Mark is the third episode of the third season of 2.5 Men. This is directed by Gary Halvorson, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I talk about what happens in this episode and share some thoughts as we go through things chronologically. And this is a really good episode. I think there's definitely a nice element of suspense to begin with. We have all of the main characters involved, which rarely happens, so that's a really nice treat. And it's interesting to see Alan going through a lot of different emotions. It starts off rather disgustingly, actually, with Jake and Charlie on the sofa. Jake is trying to get popcorn out of his teeth. He finds chicken in his teeth. He eats the chicken, and then he finds a nail in his mouth. And it's not a pleasant way to start things off, but it is entertaining. And he asks Charlie why he doesn't get to meet any of the women Alan is going on dates with. And I really like Charlie's response here. In fact, we have a few moments in this episode where Charlie definitely shows some growth and maturity. Initially, he says it's because Jake is gross, but then he actually quite sensibly explains that he doesn't want Jake to form attachments with any of the women in case it doesn't work out, which seems really sensible and definitely a sign that Charlie actually cares about how Jake perceives this situation. We then cut to later that night, and Jake is on the sofa still, and he's now eating dry cereal from the box and drinking milk from the carton. Charlie is asleep behind him. Alan comes in, obviously from his date, and Jake asks him if he got any, which was a bit awkward, but it turned around when Alan asked him, "Did I get any what?" And Jake had to ask Charlie what he meant. And I think that that's very believable. Children do often parrot things without really understanding what they're saying. And I'd rather that. I'd rather that than Jake actually knowing what he was referring to. Charlie then, once Jake is out of the room, asks Alan, why don't I get to meet any of the women? And Alan is kind of hesitant to explain anything to begin with, and this is where the suspense comes in. And I've seen this episode many times back when I used to binge watch the show, but one of the benefits of having a terrible memory is that I forget. After a decade or so, I do forget. And I didn't see coming what Alan was going to say next. First of all, he said it's not women, it's woman, singular. And then he revealed it's Judith. And I have mixed feelings about this, because on the one hand, we've watched Judith completely ripping Alan apart for several seasons. On the other, I want Alan to be happy, and if Jake has a chance of having both of his parents back together in a loving, happy marriage, then obviously that's the best case scenario. However, nobody else thinks that this is going to be a good idea, and Alan comes into the kitchen the following morning to the sight of Evelyn, Rose, and Berta. And Berta was just there waiting for her toaster strudel to pop, but Evelyn and Rose were there because they care about Alan, and they don't want him to get hurt again. And there's not much time to discuss this because Judith arrives to pick up Jake, and she and Alan begin to bicker at the front door until Jake is out of sight, and then they start talking very sweetly to one another. And it is very strange, and that's one of the fun things about this episode, is seeing characters behaving in ways that we're not used to, interacting with each other in ways that we're not used to seeing. And Alan turns around at Judith's insistence to the sight of Evelyn, Charlie, Rose and Berta all staring at them, and they're parroting answers back in unison. And it's wonderful, it's brilliantly executed, really thoroughly enjoyed it. Charlie then, a little while later, offers 2 blonde twins to Alan, and he reveals them one by lifting up the blinds, and they begin to twirl around and around and around, and Alan is obviously not interested. The next thing we know, he's over at Judith's, dropping something off. They're together watching Jake sleep, and then Judith invites Alan into the hot tub. And he goes in the hot tub, and he has a couple of remarks that are maybe not great for the situation, mostly about money, and they end up kissing, which is, again, very strange to see. And then Jake is awake, and obviously they don't want to have to explain why Alan is in the hot tub, so Alan has to go underwater multiple times, and eventually they're in bed together, and I have kind of two conflicting thoughts about this, because on the one hand, when Alan starts to question why Judith didn't do certain sexual things for him during their marriage, but she's willing or able to do it now, he's kind of bringing up the past. Judith tells him not to go into this now, and my initial thought was he's really just spoiling the moment. There is no need to go over this now. It's not the time or the place. But then I thought maybe this is Alan realising that this is actually not a good idea, or it's not what he wants. Maybe he's realising that he's just lonely, and with the option of having some kind of companionship over nobody, he chose the former. Maybe that's what he's realising in that moment. Maybe he was intentionally sabotaging the situation. So if he wasn't doing that, then I feel like he was saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. But if he was doing that, then actually that's probably a sensible approach. It wasn't sensible to jump out of the window to hide from Jake, who was coming in the room and clearly saw more than he was meant to anyway. And the next thing we know, he is back at home in his underwear, and he has to ask Charlie money for the taxi because obviously he didn't have any money and he needed to get home. I'm now wondering how he got there in the first place, because I guess his car keys would have been upstairs in his trousers. I feel like there were so many much better solutions to this problem than jumping out of the window and then immediately going for a taxi rather than calling up to Judith to send your car keys down. I don't know. I feel like it wasn't the best approach, but nevertheless, that is what happened. And I guess it gave us some comedy with Alan walking into the house in his underwear with some things to say about the ordeal. It's maybe not the strongest ending, but it wasn't too bad, and it's certainly an interesting episode. Nevertheless, Carpet Burns and a Bite Mark is definitely a pretty good episode of 2.5 Men.